You've probably been hearing a lot about ISIS and the rise of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, with its multi-pronged assault across central and northern Iraq in the past 1.5 weeks. ISIS has taken over from the al-Qaeda organization founded by Osama bin Laden as the most powerful and effective extreme jihadi group in the world. ISIS now controls or can operate with impunity in a great stretch of territory in western Iraq and eastern Syria, making it militarily the most successful jihadi movement ever, according to the New Zealand Herald. While its exact size is unclear, the group is thought to include thousands of fighters. The last S in ISIS comes from the Arabic word al-Sham, meaning Levant, Syria, or occasionally Damascus, depending on the circumstances. Led since 2010 by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, also known as Abu Du'a, it's proved itself even more violent and sectarian than what U.S. officials call the core al-Qaeda, led by al-Zawahiri, who is based in Pakistan. ISIS is highly fanatical, killing Shia Muslims and Christians whenever possible, as well as militarily efficient and under tight direction by top leaders. So I thought for the next 40 minutes or so, we'll delve into Iraq. Who is behind ISIS? What is ISIS all about? Webster Tarpley is one of the most incisive critics of Anglo-American hegemony. As an active historian, he's best known for his book George Bush, The Unauthorized Biography, a masterpiece of research, which is still a must-read. And, of course, his other books include the masterwork 9/11 Synthetic Terror, Made in the USA. And we're delighted to have him back on the program this time around to talk about Iraq. Webster Tarpley, how are you, my friend?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me.
Just give us a sense of, we're told that even al-Qaeda finds the tactics of ISIS too unsavory, which which says a lot, I suppose. But give us some insights into the MO of this group ISIS, and then we'll find out.
The stuff about too much for al-Qaeda, I think, is a kind of marketing by hyperbole. What you notice is a great desire of the Anglo-American controlled media to build up these people, right? The supermen, 10 feet tall, advancing like Tamerlane or Guderian, right? Nothing can stand in their way. And, of course, you can see what it is. This is a highly artificial organization. Why don't we start with ownership? It's generally understood that the boss, the immediate tactical commander of ISIS, one step above this Baghdadi, is a Saudi prince, because the Saudis, of course, pay for it, right? The money comes from Saudi Arabia, and the guy who funds it and therefore has the ultimate say is Abdul Rahman Faisal. Now, this is a very important family. He's one of the sons of the late King Faisal. He has two brothers that are notable. One is Prince Saud al-Faisal, who has been the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia for 30 or 40 years now. And we've also got then Prince Turki al-Faisal, who has been ambassador to London and to Washington. And then we have this Abdul Rahman Faisal, who is a graduate of the British Military Academy at Sandhurst, right, the British version of West Point, or Saint-Cyr for the French. So that's the control. Now, where do they come from as individuals? They are, of course, the typical cross-section of the jihadis and fanatics of the entire Islamic world, right, from Morocco to Indonesia, from Chechnya to Somalia, and so forth. But in particular, they have been trained by NATO. And I have articles here from Der Spiegel of Hamburg, repeated then in Reuters, and also from the London Guardian, that point out that these forces, and it's about 10,000 is the target, right, which seems to be the number of these ISIS people, were being trained at the classic base in Jordan. And they were being trained by the CIA, by the British MI6 and the Special Air Services, by the French DGSE, and, of course, the money coming from Saudi Arabia. They've also enjoyed a great deal of support from Turkey. We had one of the preludes to the Ghouta chemical warfare incident of last August, which was, of course, a sham, right, a fraud, was that a group of ISIS came storming out of southwest Turkey to attack the Syrian city of Latakia, there on the Mediterranean coast where Turkey and Syria meet, south of the city of Alexandretta, I believe. And there, these ISIS killers massacred groups of Alawite children, Christian children, and others. And apparently those are the cadavers that were put on display in the films that were used to try to popularize the notion of a Ghouta chemical weapons massacre last August. After that, these ISIS fighters were then shipped across southern Turkey and put across the border into Syria near the city of Raqqa, which is it's the province that is the farthest in the northeast of Syria, so that they could then go across the border. Now, remember that U.S. Ambassador John Negroponte, whose name is synonymous with death squads, right, since his activities in Central America, and his disciple, Ambassador Robert Ford, who superintended the building up of the current crop of death squads in Syria, they had been scheming since 10 years ago, say, or almost 10 years ago, to try to set up a force of ISIS, or well, in this case, Al-Qaeda-style Sunni, Salafi, Wahhabi, Takfiri fighters that could be used against the governments that they wanted to topple. So this is what has been attacking Assad in Syria, and it's the same operation, which has now gone across the border into Iraq. As far as Baghdadi is concerned, right, he was, of course, a U.S. prisoner of war from 2005 to 2009, and I like to say he has a 4-year degree. He's got a diploma from the U.S. as a brainwashed patsy, because once you're a U.S. POW, I hope everybody realizes that the way you get out of that is you become a double agent working for the U.S., and we've seen that with Kumu in Libya, with Shiri in Yemen, and now with Belhaj also in Libya, and now we've got the case of Baghdadi. These are people that are retooled, reconfigured, redirected to go and attack the people that the U.S. wants them to attack, and they prosper in doing so. So this entire thing is a fraud, you could say, but it's also a fraud that has a certain reality. Now, the other thing I would point to is the notion that the Iraqi forces ran away, and we're hearing about how they all disappeared. There's a very interesting French historian, Anila Khoury, who has proven, I think, beyond any doubt, that the French generals who let the Nazis roll over France with their blitzkrieg in May and June of 1940, most of those generals did this deliberately. In other words, these were French generals who actually preferred Hitler to the French Socialist Party government that they felt was oppressing them. In this case, I would say many of these Iraqi generals are bribed by the CIA. The word we're getting is that the soldiers say, we were told by our generals and by our officers that we should run away. So
All
it
right.
starts with the officers. Now,
hang on, Webster. I got to jump in here. We've got the music coming up, which is
Okay.
my cue that we're going to head into a break. On the other side, we'll continue to discuss ISIS. Who are they? Who's behind them? And whither Iraq? Back with more of The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett. Stay a while. We are talking about ISIS. And I don't know if you've seen these videos, but this group, horrifically violent. These professionally made propaganda videos that show ISIS forcing families with sons in the Iraqi army to dig their own graves before they're shot. And the message here seems to be that ISIS enemies can expect no mercy. So we're trying to figure out who is ISIS, who's behind them, and what do they want, what do they hope to achieve. Webster Tarpley is with us, philosopher of history and an author. I want to go back to the source of the story. You're saying that Der Spiegel and other groups or other organizations, other newspapers in Europe are reporting that ISIS was trained in Jordan.
They reported this in March of 2013, that a training camp in Jordan was busily preparing these people. Now, of course, they said, and these are supposed to be non-sectarian, in other words, not Salafis, not Sunni fanatics, but that's, of course, just a slight matter of redirection. You know, the Free Syrian Army no longer exists. This was funny. This was all of last year we were told by the CIA that General Salim Idris and his secular friends were going to be the counterbalance to Al-Qaeda and Nusra and the Islamic Front and all the rest of them. And this has now simply disintegrated. Any weapons that had been given to the FSA would indeed now or are in the hands of Al-Qaeda. Idris fled to Qatar in February. His number 2 is now in Sweden, and the number 3, I think, is in the Netherlands. That guy's the founder of the entire thing. So it's completely gone. So they retooled that and turned it into this grouping that you see now, which is what it was anyway all the time. Interesting to see why. First of all, the Syrian civil war is being lost by the NATO puppets. In other words, be it the Saudi paid or the French paid, any way you want to cut it, they're losing. Assad is winning. The city of Homs has been liberated. The city of Aleppo has been liberated. So the guerrillas and killers in Syria have been pushed more and more out of the inhabited areas and into the somewhat arid regions of northeast Syria. There's also a question of the overflights, right? If you seize control of northern Iraq, then the Iranians can no longer send plane loads of assistance to Assad, to Hezbollah, and to their own revolutionary guard forces that are engaged inside Syria.
Well, this is where it gets strange for me, Webster, and I need you to sort this out for me. Why is the United States talking about working with Iran to stem the tide of ISIS? What's going on there?
I think this is a kind of unavoidable byproduct. I think the principal goal is this: to get bombing. I would watch somebody like McCain. McCain seems to be the spokesman of this warmonger clique that is behind it, and I'll try to say exactly who those are. But McCain has been saying, bomb now, and if you listen to McCain and Lindsey Graham of South Carolina and some others, they also say once the bombing starts, it has to be extended into Syria immediately, and of course then they will undoubtedly cheat. In other words, they wouldn't just bomb the bases of ISIS, they would start bombing Assad, which has been the thing that they've wanted. So it's a backdoor to the war with Syria. And of course, on the other side, you could also begin saying, well, once we're bombing northern Iraq again, maybe we'll have a few of those go astray into Iran, and then it becomes very, very dangerous. I would say that the group behind this is mad as hatters. In other words, mad as March hares. And here's what I have in mind. There are 3 coups that are aimed at with this ISIS. One is the coup to overthrow Assad, right, to finally get rid of the Assad regime, which I think is not wise, because this happens to represent the only chance for something that looks like civilization in Syria.
It'll be another Libya. It'll be total lawlessness there.
It'll be something perhaps even worse, because the criminal energy in Syria is maybe greater. There's also a hope of overthrowing Maliki, right? The West has been screaming about Maliki. They want to demonize him. They want to blame him for everything. It's ridiculous, because the people that he was supposed to negotiate with never wanted to negotiate with him, right? The Sunnis consider the Shiites in Iraq to be second-class citizens, right? It's a very strong, deeply rooted prejudice. But the coup that interests me the most is the one here in Washington, because the goal of all of this is to finally get control of Obama and make him into what he has been reluctant to be, and that is a warmonger, an aggressor. Obama, of course, typically is a weak passive president. But if you look at his response to the recent crises, you can see that the U.S. ruling class is apoplectic with rage. There is a war psychosis here. And it goes something like this. They say, we wanted to bomb Syria, and you, Obama, got in the way. You let Putin avoid the bombing of Syria. They also say, we never wanted to negotiate with Iran. We wanted to bomb Iran. And here again, Obama, you've got this negotiation going, and this is unacceptable.
And they're also saying if you hadn't pulled out those troops from Iraq, we'd have more options. We'd have boots on the ground now.
Yes,
we'd have options.
But of course, that was Maliki at the time, right, under domestic pressure, which you can see. You can imagine how much domestic pressure there was. Get those Americans out of here forever, and none of them remain. And that was their position. This was nothing that Obama could change, as far as I can see. There was also quite a bit of pressure of U.S. public opinion saying, no, not 10, not 15, not even 1, get them all out. There's also a huge embassy and quite a few hundred Marines and others. But the other one, of course, that weighs heavily on the U.S. ruling elite is Ukraine, right? They feel tremendously humiliated that they haven't been able to deliver for this neo-Nazi clique in Lvov and in Kiev, that Putin has been able to assert some kind of Russian defensive posture, I would say, right? With his back to the wall after all these years of NATO expansion, he prevented NATO from grabbing the entirety of Ukraine. There is a school in the ruling class that says, put one NATO division into Ukraine. That is Jessica Matthews of the Carnegie Endowment and the board of Harvard University. She says one U.S. brigade and then one battalion from each of 5 or 6 NATO countries. I'm sure Canada will be one of them. If it comes to this, 2 brigades would make one division. So that would be one division. However, the alternate school, Anne Marie Slaughter from the State Department, what a name. I guess her name is her program. She says it's a mistake to attack Putin in Ukraine because he's too strong there. Better to attack him in Syria. And then, lo and behold, now we see something that looks like a plan to bomb Syria. I would simply point out we've had this night of the living dead here. All of the neocons have risen from their graves, and that would be Perle and Wolfowitz and Max Boot and the entire cabal from 10 years ago, right? The authors of this catastrophic war. And above all, we have Cheney. Cheney assisted now with his daughter, put out in the Wall Street Journal on Wednesday, a tirade which I would read it as a call for a coup d'etat against Obama, quite frankly. Obama's been wrong about everything. Obama's a fool. Obama is blind. And then Obama is betraying the U.S. past and squandering U.S. freedom. It sounds like, will nobody stop this man, right, in the murder in the cathedral. But you get the idea. The goal of this, and McCain has said it, McCain wants everybody out, Kerry out, Rice out, and he wants General Petraeus, the CIA and the Pentagon, in, General Keane, left over from the 2007 surge, in, and Ryan Crocker, who was the U.S. ambassador during the surge. So you get the idea. Crocker says you can't undo an invasion, but you can undo a premature disengagement by re-engaging. And of course, he doesn't spell out what he means by that, but it's clear, right? He wants to start the war anew. And behind this group are the Kagans, right? Kim Kagan, Institute for the Study of War, Frederick Kagan, American Enterprise Institute. This is the surge again. Robert Kagan, top advisor to Romney on foreign affairs, and his charming wife, Victoria Nuland, the foul-mouthed one, right? The blankety-blank, the EU.
Right. Let me just recap here. Let me just recap, Webster. So you're saying that it's the old, create the disease in order to offer the cure. So so NATO and their allies train ISIS in this camp in Jordan, unleash them in Iraq and Syria to destabilize in Iraq. In the case of Iraq, it's Prime Minister Maliki. And that will give them the excuse to put boots back on the ground in Iraq, or to
maybe it doesn't have to go quite that far. Remember, the goal is a coup in Baghdad, and the coup in Baghdad would be Maliki out, and then they say a national unity government. But what they want is Alawi, the classical U.S. and NATO puppet, Iyad Alawi. He has been prime minister. This, by the way, is another reason that WikiLeaks and Assange were a CIA limited hangout, because if you go back to the WikiLeaks pile, lots of bad things about Maliki, right? Maliki is demonized there, too. So Maliki has been demonized here 6 ways to Sunday.
But hasn't Iraq been
zombies come out?
But hasn't Maliki Iraq under Maliki been a pretty good client state for the United States already?
I suppose it's a mixed picture. Just that the U.S. the let's call it the rogue network, right? The invisible government, because Obama does not command these people. Rather, they seek to command Obama. They don't want Maliki because he's pro-Iranian. The argument begins and ends with that. If you're pro-Iran, they want you out. Now, of course, as you point out, there is this contradiction that a number of these U.S. characters are saying, well, we want the Iranians to do the dirty work for us. Maybe a couple of things about that. One is that some of the neocons are already trying to push the Iranians out. Max Boot, for example, top neocon and one of the people in the high levels of the Romney campaign. Max Boot has got an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this week. No cooperation with Iran, demonize Iran, don't let this change. So they're worried about that. And of course, again, once the bombing starts, if it starts, then it might creep into Syria, might creep into Iran. I would also point out Rouhani, right, the head of Iran, is warning the Saudis, saying to them essentially, you are creating a Frankenstein's monster, right? We know you are paying for ISIS, but ISIS will not stop. ISIS is going to come to Riyadh and overthrow you as well. It's like Philippe Égalité during the French Revolution, if you know that one, right? A member of the royal family tried to ride the tiger of the revolution, ended up on the guillotine, head chopped off. So that's what's looking at these Saudi royals. But again, the thing that concerns me perhaps most is the U.S. coup, that you've got this ruling class, and this is not just neocons. This is the humanitarian bombers, the Samantha Power group, the responsibility to protect people. They're part of it. You've got the Islamophobia group led by the neocon Bolton, but you've also got some Clinton Gate people, this law professor Jonathan Turley. So you've got a whole series of networks that are coming forward. And the main demand they have is that Obama is not the warmonger they want, and somehow they've got to get control of him and force him to do these things. Because if you look at what Obama has done, it's a series of token actions. He's stalling. He doesn't do this for national interest reason. I think he just sees that it's bad for Obama. If you start a war, then 6 months into the war, you're going to be impeached, right? If you bomb now, you can count the months until you will be impeached and removed from office, because these are Republicans who hate him. And if they get the majority in November in the Senate, then they can quite possibly remove him from office.
All right, got to jump in here.
Got
to jump in here. Webster Tarpley stays with us back on the other side as we continue to drill down on ISIS in Iraq. Back with more of The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett. Stay with us. Welcome back. And according to informed Jordanian officials, this is being reported in a number of European newspapers, Der Spiegel in Germany, members of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIS, which is rampaging across Iraq, apparently trained in 2012 by U.S. instructors working at a secret base in Jordan. And we're learning from Webster Tarpley that they are being funded largely by members of the Saudi royal family. Here we go again. We're being suckered, apparently, once again. But I guess, Webster, the war party has decided that they're not going to be able to succor us with the weapons of mass destruction lie this time. So is that why they've gone to the effort to create this this band of animals in order to convince or to galvanize public support for some sort of military action?
Well, if you look carefully, we're back to 9/11, and the idea that if you allow these takfiris, right, these primitive characters, if you give them a base or a sanctuary from which they can operate, then they'll organize 9/11. And I've written a whole book trying to show how absurd that whole thing is, how this could never be done. And in any case, if you're concerned about that, as you pointed out before, you should be looking at Libya, where large sanctuaries have now been available rather closer to Europe and the sea lanes and so forth. I would say one of the funny things, crazy things from the U.S. point of view, is you're expected to regard Assad of Syria as an enemy. I don't think he is. I think he's fighting against terrorism. If you want to destroy the bases of ISIS, those are in Syria. You ought to work with Assad to destroy those bases. And, of course, Iran is the most stable country in the entire area. It's an island of stability and to some degree of rationality compared to ISIS. On the other hand, you're supposed to regard Saudi Arabia as an ally. Look at this. The Saudi elite, the Saudi royal family, is pouring money into terrorism in Syria and in Iraq, the ISIS, and somehow that's tolerable. I recommend one of the ways to end this crisis very fast, a 24-hour ultimatum by the United States and whoever wants to join in, saying, Saudi royal family, stop it. Stop funding those terrorists. No more logistics, or else you're on your own. You can make your own plans for self-defense. And, of course, they can't do it. And it's also funny when you see Cheney goes through he's got this, as I say, this screed in the Wall Street Journal at midweek, it's one of the most violent tirades against the president. And again, to me, it reads like an invitation to disgruntled military people to be insubordinate, right? To look at the possibilities of a putsch. In Cheney's article, he says, when I talk to people in the Middle East, they say, why are you betraying us? How come you're not supporting us? Let's turn that around. I would say to the Saudis and the Qatar people and the entire Gulf, why are you betraying us by funding terrorism that is undermining this attempt by the U.S., whatever you want to call it, to have some kind of a stable government in Iraq? And again, you got to distinguish between the Obama White House, which is, again, a passive and somewhat timid player, but nevertheless seems to represent a moment of breaking, right? Putting on the brakes, compared to the CIA and these other forces who are raving, and this clique in the Congress around McCain and Lindsey Graham and the rest of them, right? And I think a lot of people can't quite register the fact that Obama might have been Trilateral Commission, 2008, and very bad at the time. But he has long since been surpassed in evil by these other people, so much so that when Obama ended the Iraq War in 2011, I think that was what the population here wanted. And the response to that was Benghazi. In other words, I call it an October surprise in the era of early voting, right? You had to have the October surprise in September to make sure you'd impact all the people who were sending in their ballots in the beginning of October. That was done, in my view, by Petraeus, by Bolton, by Carter Ham, and others. And the goal of that was to make Romney the president, because all the neocons had attached themselves to Romney, and we're seeing that same faction in action now around Petraeus. Petraeus is the leader of the neocon faction.
All right, let's take a time out, Webster. We'll come back. We'll do one more segment and continue to discuss ISIS in Iraq, and time permitting, we'll get around to Ukraine as well. It's still happening, folks, Ukraine. Let's not forget about Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Back with more of The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett. Don't go away. Webster Tarpley stays with us for a few moments yet, and Webster's website is tarpley.net, TARPLEY. .net. I just want to ask you a couple more questions regarding ISIS, and then I want to move into Crimea and Ukraine and Putin. And Baghdadi, is he being built up to be the next Osama bin Laden?
It's possible, but again, remember, he's a graduate of a U.S. Brainwashing academy for terrorists. I mean, he doesn't have the Guantanamo Bay degree, but like somebody like Belhaj, right? Belhaj, big warlord in Libya these days, he was only in U.S. custody for a couple of years in Bagram or someplace in Afghanistan and that theater. So again, the fact of being 4 years in a U.S. prisoner of war camp and then being let out, this tells you something, and it's the opposite of what the stupid reactionary might think, right? Where reactionaries are all screaming, "Oh, you let them out. They fooled you. They went back to the fight." Yes, they go back to the fight, but they're going back to fight against Assad, Gaddafi, or in this case, Maliki, who are U.S. targets. So they're working for the U.S., right? Probably it's going to be hard to duplicate the tremendous media buildup, right? The hundreds of millions of dollars in free publicity that were invested in Osama.
And Baghdadi, is, as you say, a graduate of the military training academy. Was that Camp Bucca?
Yes, Bucca. That's where he got a light rinse, I would say.
A light rinse.
A light rinse.
All right, let's talk about our attention has been diverted from Crimea, but you're saying that the war party has decided they're not going to confront Putin in Ukraine. He's too strong there, and so the idea is to take the war to Russia, but do it in Syria. But let's talk about what's happening. Just bring us up to date on what's going on in Ukraine.
Let me just do it from the point of view of what we know here. This past Monday and Tuesday, we had a very high-level event. It's called the World U.S.-Russia Forum, and it's people of a very, again, very high level. We had a former Russian Prime Minister, Stepashin, involved. We had Sergei Mironov, the head of the Equitable Russia Party, represented in the State Duma. We had a former Russian ambassador to Washington. The remarks that I would focus on, those of Professor Stephen Cohen, who is a former professor at Princeton and NYU. He's also the husband of Katrina vanden Heuvel, the owner of The Nation magazine, and Cohen is a reasonable authority on Russian affairs in a time of great madness, and his points were two. The first is that Putin is under tremendous pressure from Russian public opinion to step in, because we've got this chocolate king, right, Poroshenko, the new president of Ukraine. His government is still chock full of neo-fascists and neo-Nazis. One of them is this guy Yarosh, who threatened some time ago to blow up gas and oil pipelines, and lo and behold, this past week that has happened. But the idea is that Poroshenko is continuing to send his military to kill large numbers of civilians in Lugansk, in Donetsk, and so forth. And the one common denominator from all Russian spokesmen at this conference, which was held in the Hart Senate office building, it was held in part of the U.S. Congress, the demand is call off this military attack on the civilians, because the Russian public opinion can see this, and they're saying to Putin, what you're doing is not enough. We want action now. We want you to interdict these genocidal moves by the Ukrainian forces. And the demand that they're making is a no-fly zone. The U.S. has extended no-fly zones, right, in Iraq over many, many years, the entire decade of the 1990s practically. And in that case, what they're saying is, Putin, we want the Russian Air Force to interdict any military flights, any flights at all coming into eastern Ukraine. That's number one, and that's what he's getting from his sources, right? This guy Cohen. The second point that he makes is that if this crisis goes on, there is a tangible risk of tactical nuclear warfare, nuclear exchange. And I was very glad to hear this, because I have been saying similar things about Ukraine since about 2004. It is the only place in the world where a clash between two military establishments with nuclear armament can occur. There's nothing like this in the Middle East. It's just not there. But in this case, we could have Polish NATO troops intervening in support of the Kiev regime, and they're more likely to do it because Poland wants a piece of Ukraine, right? Most of Ukraine was a part of Poland at one time or another. They probably want it back. You could have Polish troops coming in from the west, Russian troops coming in from the east. The Russian troops have nuclear weapons. The Polish troops would make an appeal to the U.S. for the nuclear umbrella, and you could see World War III taking off. And this is not hyperbole. This is not an exaggeration. This is very definitely something that could happen. We're much too close to this right now. It would be time for, I think, the United States and Russia ought to tell this guy Poroshenko, stop it, stop what you're doing. And, of course, the U.S. is doing the opposite, right? We've got the neocon, again, Madame Kagan, also known as Victoria Nuland, right, the foul-mouthed one, has been, urging, undoubtedly spurring on Poroshenko and Yarosh and Chanibok and the rest of these fascists, really, that's all we can call them, to be more and more militant, to be more and more hostile to the Russians. Right? So I think from Obama's point of view, this stuff is way out of his control. He is confronted with a fait accompli every day. Now, he ought to assert himself and put a stop to it, but
his presidency is effectively over. But I mean, so Poroshenko is being encouraged to provoke Putin. It sounds like they want nuclear war.
The idea, when you're dealing with neocons, they will always tell you, don't worry, the other side will back down. That was the case, for example, just before 9/11. In the first months of the Bush administration, we had this American spy plane, electronic surveillance plane, that was forced down. It had a collision with a Chinese fighter. It tried to land in Vietnam, but it landed in China. Remember that one?
I do. I recall that.
The neocons, as I write in my book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror, that you were kind enough to mention before, the neocons at that point wanted to go to the brink. They wanted to say, give us back that plane within 6 hours, or we're going to do this, that, and the other thing. And they thought that they could get the Chinese to back down. In this case, they would say, if you really go to the brink and threaten an all-out nuclear first strike, then Putin will back down. I think this is a terrible mistake. These people, you can see, they're not reliable, right? Their whole track record is bungling and so forth, but they're addicted, they're wedded to that kind of a doctrine. So you're dealing with people who are lunatics, right? And it's just 100 years since Sarajevo, and I don't know if this was covered in any of your talks there with Jim Mars, but Sarajevo, this was British intelligence acting through various Serbian, assets that they had to set off a general European war. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We've got some very interesting accounts that some top people in London were sitting around on that afternoon and they were saying, hey, has the news come in from Sarajevo? Do we have any news on the telegraph and so forth? And then when it came, they went into action. So that was 100 years ago this week.
And
so, it has happened. It can happen again.
Well, what has you more worried? The situation in Iraq, Syria with ISIS, or the situation in Crimea?
Well, because these lunatic neocons and their responsibility to protect humanitarian bomber colleagues, they all see that as a single engagement. In other words, it's a struggle for world domination, and they feel that they've been humiliated and that somehow they've got to assert themselves. I would urge them to look at it the other way. One of the things, the point was made by Sergei Mironov at this U.S.-Russian meeting on Capitol Hill. He pointed out that there is no major problem in the world that can be solved without the agreement of Russia and the United States, right? He said this is the most important geostrategic relationship in the world. And I would read that as the offer of a condominium. It essentially says, why not have a joint directorate for significant parts of the world of the United States and Russia? For example, it would be capable of saying to Saudi Arabia, stop it, and they would have to take that very seriously. You could also tell the Israelis and the Palestinians, here's the peace deal, this is what it's going to be, now you implement it. You could also go to China and Japan and say, look, these rocks in the ocean that you're so concerned about do not interest the rest of the world as much as they do you. You're going to cool it on that, because we're not going to have World War III over this idiotic pile of rocks. And there are similar other points around the world, right? You could imagine a solution to Cyprus or any number of other things. That would be U.S. and Russia working together for war avoidance, right?
Well, maybe I'm naive, Webster, but Putin strikes me as someone that the West could very easily work with. I mean,
yes.
But he's everyone prefaces before they say Putin, they say former KGB Putin, or they say he's the new Hitler. But as far as I'm concerned, nothing could be further from the truth. As an Orthodox Christian, I see what he's done with the rebuilding 26,000 Orthodox churches in Russia. He's given them their land back. He's an avowed a free market capitalist.
Well, now, wait a minute. That gets to be a problem. I would just say this. Russia has always been concerned about overland invasions. Poland in the 1600s, Sweden in the 1700s, France with Napoleon in the 1800s, Germany and Hitler in the 1900s, all come through White Russia and Ukraine. You have to understand that they have a right to a friendly government there.
Oh, absolutely. I agree.
They're very concerned about warm water ports, and they don't like Nazi ideology because of the 25 million dead in World War II.
No, Putin
his position is reasonable. You're right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Listen, I wish we had more time, Webster, but we'll pick it up again. And you're going to join me on Coast to Coast next week. Looking forward to that.
Look forward to it. Thank you so much.
All right. Tarpley.net. Thanks, Webster.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. You've probably been hearing a lot about ISIS and the rise of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, with its multi-pronged assault across central and northern Iraq in the past 1.5 weeks. ISIS has taken over from the al-Qaeda organization founded by Osama bin Laden as the most powerful and effective extreme jihadi group in the world. ISIS now controls or can operate with impunity in a great stretch of territory in western Iraq and eastern Syria, making it militarily the most successful jihadi movement ever, according to the New Zealand Herald. While its exact size is unclear, the group is thought to include thousands of fighters. The last S in ISIS comes from the Arabic word al-Sham, meaning Levant, Syria, or occasionally Damascus, depending on the circumstances. Led since 2010 by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, also known as Abu Duwa, it's proved itself even more violent and sectarian than what U.S. officials call the core al-Qaeda, led by al-Zawahiri, who is based in Pakistan. ISIS is highly fanatical, killing Shia Muslims and Christians whenever possible, as well as militarily efficient and under tight direction by top leaders. So I thought for the next 40 minutes or so, we'll delve into Iraq. Who is behind ISIS? What is ISIS all about? Webster Griffin Tarpley is one of the most incisive critics of Anglo-American hegemony. As an active historian, he's...
Of course, the money coming from Saudi Arabia. They've also enjoyed a great deal of support from Turkey. We had one of the preludes to the Ghouta chemical warfare incident of last August, which was, of course, a sham, right, a fraud, was that a group of ISIS came storming out of southwest Turkey to attack the Syrian city of Latakia, there on the Mediterranean coast where Turkey and Syria meet, south of the city of Alexandretta, I believe. And there, these ISIS killers massacred groups of Alawite children, Christian children, and others. And apparently those are the cadavers that were put on display in the films that were used to try to popularize the notion of a Ghouta chemical weapons massacre last August. After that, these ISIS fighters were then shipped across southern Turkey and put across the border into Syria near the city of Raqqa, which is it's the province that is the farthest in the northeast of Syria, so that they could then go across the border. Now, remember that U.S. Ambassador John Negroponte, whose name is synonymous with death squads, right, since his activities in Central America, and his disciple, Ambassador Robert Ford, who superintended the building up of the current crop of death squads in Syria, they had been scheming since 10 years ago, say, or almost 10 years ago, to try to set up a force of ISIS, or well, in this case, Al-Qaeda-style Sunni, Salafi, Wahhabi, Takfiri fighters that could be used against the governments that they wanted to topple. So this is what has been attacking Assad in Syria, and it's the same operation, which has now gone across the border into Iraq. As far as Baghdadi is concerned, right, he was, of course, a U.S. prisoner of war from 2005 to 2009, and I like to say he has a 4-year degree. He's got a diploma from the U.S. as a brainwashed patsy, because once you're a U.S. POW, I hope everybody realizes that the way you get out of that is you become a double agent working for the U.S., and we've seen that with Kumu in Libya, with Shiri in Yemen, and now with Belhaj also in Libya, and now we've got the case of Baghdadi. These are people that are retooled, reconfigured, redirected to go and attack the people that the U.S. wants them to attack, and they prosper in doing so. So this entire thing is a fraud, you could say, but it's also a fraud that has a certain reality. Now, the other thing I would point to is the notion that the Iraqi forces ran away, and we're hearing about how they all disappeared. There's a very interesting French historian, Anila Khoury, who
is best known for his book George Bush, The Unauthorized Biography, a masterpiece of research, which is still a must-read. And, of course, his other books include the masterwork 9/11 Synthetic Terror, Made in the USA. And we're delighted to have him back on the program this time around to talk about Iraq. Webster Tarpley, how are you, my friend?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me.
Just give us a sense of, we're told that even Al-Qaeda finds the tactics of ISIS too unsavory, which which says a lot, I suppose. But give us some insights into the MO of this group ISIS, and then we'll find out.
The stuff about too much for Al-Qaeda, I think, is a kind of marketing by hyperbole. What you notice is a great desire of the Anglo-American controlled media to build up these people, right? The supermen, 10 feet tall, advancing like Tamerlane or Guderian, right? Nothing can stand in their way. And, of course, you can see what it is. This is a highly artificial organization. Why don't we start with ownership? It's generally understood that the boss, the immediate tactical commander of ISIS, one step above this Baghdadi, is a Saudi prince, because the Saudis, of course, pay for it, right? The money comes from Saudi Arabia, and the guy who funds it and therefore has the ultimate say is Abdul Rahman Faisal. Now, this is a very important family. He's one of the sons of the late King Faisal. He has two brothers that are notable. One is Prince Saud al-Faisal, who has been the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia for 30 or 40 years now. And we've also got then Prince Turki al-Faisal, who has been ambassador to London and to Washington. And then we have this Abdul Rahman Faisal, who is a graduate of the British Military Academy at Sandhurst, right? The British version of West Point, or Saint-Cyr for the French. So that's the control. Now, where do they come from as individuals? They are, of course, the typical cross-section of the jihadis and fanatics of the entire Islamic world, right, from Morocco to Indonesia, from Chechnya to Somalia, and so forth. But in particular, they have been trained by NATO. And I have articles here from Der Spiegel of Hamburg, repeated then in Reuters, and also from the London Guardian, that point out that these forces, and it's about 10,000 is the target, right, which seems to be the number of these ISIS people, were being trained at the classic base in Jordan. And they were being trained by the CIA, by the British MI6 and the Special Air Services, by the French DGSE, and